Back there behind me is old downtown Brea. Now you and I both know it's been there a long time. In fact, some of the buildings down there were built even before Brea became an incorporated city in 1917. Today we're going to be taking a tour of some of those buildings, including Sam's Place and that two-story brick building just north of Sam's, the old Sewell building, which was Brea's first city hall. We're also going to be taking some side trips to learn about the two industries that helped to make Brea the city it is today. That's citrus and, of course, oil. Now, during the next approximately 1.5 hours, I guarantee you that you're going to be hearing about and seeing some things about Old Brea that are going to surprise you. And hopefully, when you're all done, you'll be just as enthusiastic about Brea's early history as I am. Now, right now, I'm standing on top of the Old Brea Hotel, which has been here ever since the town was first laid out. And it's very fitting that I begin here because the first segment that you're going to be seeing is about this particular building. So why don't I climb down the ladder now, get off the building, go out in front, and let's get started. Back in the very early days of Brea in 1912, there was a real shortage of housing here for all the oil workers that came from all over the United States to work in our local oil fields. Now up in Brea Canyon, there were some small little houses built on top of the hills and on the sides of the hills for the oil workers, but there really weren't enough. So in 1912, construction on the Brea Hotel began. Now if we could go back to 1913, when construction ended, this hotel would have looked a lot different than it does right now. You can see this coating of stucco that's on the building. Well, that wasn't even put on until 1939. So underneath that coating of stucco, there is an old wood building there. It was built in the Craftsman commercial style, which is very popular at that time. Now we have another building in Brea that was also built in the Craftsman commercial style, and that's Sam's Place. Now up there at the top, you can see that there is a plaque. And that plaque up there really has no significance that I know of other than being kind of a decorative plaque. There's a similar plaque at the other end of the building. There is also some fancy scroll work that was up at the top, and that's been covered up by stucco, but we have old photographs and it was very attractive. Now in the old photographs, this almost looked like two different hotels. And the two different portions of it were joined by a small little hall that was right in the center of the building. Now later on in the hotel's history, that hall was brought out forward to make room for another apartment. And it also made the front of the hotel look much larger than it is today. For those of you who have never been up in the Brea Hotel, what it looks like upstairs is there are two long halls that stretch from the front of the building to the back. And on both sides of those halls, there are small little rooms. Now you can tell this is an old hotel because there are no bathrooms in the room. The bathrooms are at the end of the hall. There are also showers at the end of the hall. There used to be bathtubs, but they're not there any longer. Now most people know this building is only the Brea Hotel, but it's had different names over the years. Shortly after it was built, it was called the Kinstler Hotel. Now Mr. Kinstler was an important man in Brea's early history, and he headed the drive for incorporation in 1916, and when Brea became a city in 1917, he served as Brea's first city clerk. The hotel over the years has also been called the Ozark Hotel, and it's been called the New Sheraton Hotel. As you can see, there are 5 different businesses down here in front. Well, I'm not going to count one of the businesses because the one in the center originally was the lobby of the old hotel. Well, businesses have come and gone over the years. There have been several cafes in here. There's been an electrical shop. There's been a plumbing shop. Down here also, one of the businesses was originally a moving picture theater, and that was when the building was called the Kinstler Hotel. Now what a moving picture theater was not like our regular movie theater. It was where probably somebody hung a piece of canvas on the wall or the movies were shown up on the wall. This was during the teens. One of the businesses here, the second business here from the right, was also the Brea Post Office at one time. Kind of an interesting little sidelight about one of the businesses here is this was the Brea bus depot during the 1940s. Now you can see that this hotel has had a long and kind of an interesting history. Now it's certainly seen better days, but it's still a great reminder of the days of Old Brea. Well, next time what we're going to be doing is we're going to be walking only a few yards south here to the intersection of Brea Boulevard and Ash Street, to talk about some of the buildings around that intersection, because that was the first intersection in town. It's a very historic one. The next several segments you're going to be seeing originally appeared on local cable television. So until next time, I'm Brian Saul. Today we're at the intersection of Brea Boulevard and Ash Street. And you've probably driven along here many times without knowing that this particular intersection where we are was the first intersection in Brea, and it's surrounded by some of the oldest buildings in the city. For instance, over there behind me, which was once a carpet store, was at one time Salveson's Market. And over here across the street is the Old Brea Hotel, which was built in 1913 and was the temporary home of some of the early oil workers of the city. Where you can now see Canning's Hardware used to be a mercantile store. And for those of you who don't know what a mercantile store is, it was a general store where they sold dresses for the women, they sold produce, they sold all sorts of things that the people of the town might need. Behind me is probably the most important and historic building in all of Brea. It was built in 1913. It was the home of the La Habra Valley Bank. Now, if you saw the building back in 1913, when it was built, it would have looked a lot different than it does right now. If you look over there right now, you can see that the building doesn't look old. It doesn't look historic. That's because in the 1950s, approximately, it was modernized to make way for the Brea Post Office, which was here during the 60s and the 70s. Now, when this building was first built, there used to be columns. These little half walls that are here now used to be like Roman columns. And there's a mystery whether those columns are still inside. Nobody really knows for sure. Also up above here, where there is some metal covering the top of the building, there was some fancy scroll work. And that's also a mystery whether that scroll work is still here. Ah, Dyer.
How are you?
How you doing? Fine. Good.
Fine.
Great. Dyer, tell me something. There's somebody told me that you used to work in this bank. Is that true?
I used to work here in this bank as a janitor, and also I was a guard here in the Depression year. And Mr. Cox was the cashier, Mrs. Inge was assistant cashier during the Depression years. And later, after I left, I got a job different places in town. There was a robbery here. And Mr. Cox run out the door, and they run down West Ash here, and he was shooting at them with a pistol. But he never did stop them, as far as I know, and nobody ever says where they ever captured these robberies or not. But times is hard, times you couldn't find a job, and I could live on $1 a day, and that means cleaning up and doing the janitor work. Thank you.
And thank you very much. That was great.
My pleasure.
Okay. Bye. Now, it's not so much what happened inside this building that makes this building so historic. It's what happened in the back of the building. And let's go back there and I'll tell you what happened. In a way, here's where Brea began. Behind this door in 1917 is where people came to vote for or against incorporation. At that time, there were 732 people in Brea, and 204 voted for incorporation, and only 45 against. We have become a city. For Video Brea Line, I'm Brian Saul. At one time, there were over 200,000 citrus trees in Brea, and today we'll be visiting with Dean Millen, who was one of the early growers in the city. Dean, can you tell me how the citrus industry began here in Brea?
Well, Brian, as near as I can determine the history, it began somewhere around the turn of the century. Probably the Union Oil Company, with its development of oil in the area, was acquiring many acres of land in the area. And according to the Orange County Directory of 1903, there's an ad in there that indicates that Brea, the town of Randolph, the area of Randolph, it wasn't a town, I don't think, at that time, but it was the area of Randolph that was advertising 2,000 acres of good orange and walnut land with water. So as far as I'm concerned, that has to be the beginning of the citrus industry in this area. There are groves that were planted prior to the bulk of the groves in 26, but many of them were planted back in 1915, 16 in that area, some of the older groves that were in this area. Then there was the Hualdi, which was a Basque family out east of town that planted lemons, and they planted a grove, 40 acres of lemons, which at one time was probably the best producing lemon acreage in Orange County.
The packing crate labels, what were they used for, Dean?
To identify the packing house, the quality of fruit that would be ultimately go to market, and the shippers were very aware of the label, so that the ultimate buyer would be as aware of it as they were, so that they could buy the fruit on a wholesale basis on a label only.
These were the crates that were used to ship the citrus.
These are the wood crates, yes, that they used for years up until the 50s, which is now all shipped in cardboard. But the fruit would come into a packing house, be processed. It would come along after it was graded and sized, and the women would stand here and fill the boxes, wrap the fruit, fill the boxes. When it was full, they would raise it up and roll it off onto a conveyor belt, where it would go and be lidded and recorded and so on. And of course, the important part of all of this is the label that was on the end of the box. This happens to be an old label from Tustin Citrus Valencia House, but we have others. This just happened to be the one box that I have a one on.
A label on the box.
I used to take my other labels, and because I have them framed, but I used to put them on here when they have them down to the exhibit.
Now, these are some of the tools you use for the picking and the packing of the oranges and lemons?
That's right, Brian. These were used for picking the oranges, the citrus, and these were the sizes that they used to be graded for, and those were rings that they used to use. That's a spray nozzle that we used to use for spraying trees, mostly with a very fine grade of oil to smother the... we used to have a lot more pests than we have today.
Brea's slogan is oil, oranges, and opportunity. This week we talked about oranges, and next week we'll be talking about oil. For Video Brea Line, I'm Brian Saul.
Today we're in Brea Canyon, and when Gaspar de Portela, the Spanish explorer, passed through here in 1769, little did he know that he was passing through what would later become one of the most valuable areas in Orange County. It was valuable, of course, because of the oil. And today we'll be talking about that oil, a little history of the canyon, and some of its first inhabitants. But before we do, there's something down by the creek that I want to show you. Now, the Indians were the first people to know about the oil in Brea Canyon. They come to places like this, which are called seeps, where the oil is seeping out of the ground, and it's become tar or brea. When it becomes tar, when some of the parts of the oil evaporate, and they would come here for a very particular reason, for a reason that most people don't even know about, and that is to get tar to put in their baskets. I mean, it's kind of a strange thing for people to do, to put tar in baskets, but the reason they did that is to waterproof them, so they could come down to a stream like this, gather the water, and take it home to their village. Now, today I'm going to do an experiment. This is something I've always wanted to do because I taught 4th grade here in Brea, and I always taught about the Indians and how they did this, and I was always curious if it really worked. So I have some tar today. I have a basket, and I'm going to put that tar in the basket and see if it really works. So just smear this around inside, which isn't smearing very well. It probably has to be much warmer than it is right now. Also, I forgot to mention that what the Indians would do, besides using the tar, they would also use the sap from pine trees and mix it in with the tar, and that's what I did this morning. But it has to be much softer than this, because this is not working. We know that Indians lived in this area because in Tonner Canyon, arrowheads were found. Also, scientists believe that Indians have been in this area for approximately the last 4,000 years. When the Spanish explorers arrived here, they used to call the Indians in this particular area the white Indians because they had such fair skins. I'm going to put this basket aside now, but before we move on, I want to tell you that later, people who were looking for oil when they came through here in the late 19th century found seeps like this, just as the Indians had done, and they realized there must be oil in the hills here. So right now we're going to move on, and we're going to look and hear about a little of the history of this canyon as regards to the oil industry. The first oil well was drilled here in 1899, and since then, the oil wells you see around you have been heavy producers of oil. Now, if we could go back in time to 1899, up until about 1920, this canyon would have looked completely different than it does right now. The trees you see around you wouldn't have been here then. They've been planted since. Also, a lot of the vegetation wasn't here then. The hills were almost bare. So up on the hills, the hilltops behind me, there would have been small little houses for the oil workers. And when the oil workers weren't needed up here in the hills, when a lot became automated, a lot of those little houses were taken and transplanted to downtown Brea. Now, the oil well you see behind me is made out of metal. But once again, if we could go back to 1917, that oil well would have been made out of large pieces of redwood. Beneath the oil well, there would have been a large pumping and drilling unit. Next week, we'll be going back into Brea to visit one of our city's landmarks and make our final farewell to the city's oldest commercial building. For Video Brea Line, I'm Brian Saul. I'm standing here on Brea Boulevard next to what a lot of people think is an historic landmark in the city, the old clock. I'm sure most people drive by here in their cars and they look up at this clock and think, my gosh, this thing is probably old and it's been here a long time. Well, they'd be half right. It is old. We know it came from a railway station in Riverside. It's an old railway clock. But as for being here a long time, it really hasn't. It's only been here less than 20 years. Back in the early 1970s, behind me in the Brea Hotel, there was a clockmaker who opened an antique clock shop. As part of an advertising gimmick, he set this clock in front of the hotel. Well, he was here about 3 or 4 years, and then he decided he was going to move to Tustin, and he took his clock with him. But after these 3 or 4 years, this had become such a landmark in the city that the people wanted it back. As long as I'm standing here, I want to tell you something about the building behind us, which is the oldest commercial building in Brea. It's called the Wall Building. It was built in 1911. At one time, the upper floor was used as a hotel, and then later on it was divided in 2 apartments. And in one apartment lived the Crable family, and the other apartment lived the Wall family, and that's how the building got its name, the Wall Building. On the first floor on your left was the first barber shop in Brea, and on your right there used to be an old drugstore. Now, there's something interesting I want to tell you about this building. At one time, it was used in the movie Silver Streak, but you had to look really closely because there was only a little short scene about it. Also, there's an empty lot over there on the corner, and this building wasn't always in this location. It used to sit on that empty lot on the corner of Ash and Brea Boulevard, and then in the 1950s, it was picked up and it was moved to its present location. As you can see, on Easter morning, something pretty bad happened to this building. It burned down. Now I'd like to show you some of Brea's earliest firefighting equipment. I'm here at Fire Station number 1 on Berry Street. What you see is Brea's first fire truck. It's a 1923 Seagraves, and there's a story about this fire truck that I think is kind of interesting. When Brea purchased it in 1923, it had to be brought out on the back of a train from Columbus, Ohio, where it was made. And on the way out, it made a stop in San Bernardino. Well, during that night, there was a packing house fire in San Bernardino, and San Bernardino didn't have a truck. So what they did is they borrowed our truck. And they promised they would order another one for us. Well, what you see here, to make a long story short, is not the original truck that we ordered, but is the truck that they ordered for us. So this is actually the second truck that came out from back east. This is what the hats look like in the early days of the Brea Fire Department.
In our next Video Brea line, we'll be talking about a major disaster that hit Brea in 1926. For Video Brea line, I'm Brian Saul.
Today we're going back to April 8th, 1926 to talk about the biggest disaster ever to hit Brea. Now there's some people still in the town that remember this event, and we're going to talk with them later. Now behind me is kind of a shrunken version of the old Stewart Tank Farm. And back in 1926, this would have been a huge tank farm, much larger than it is right now. There would have been a lot of oil holding tanks, presently only 2. There would have been several huge oil reservoirs. There also would have been some oil workers' homes and a small refinery built in 1911. Now in the morning of April 8th, 1926, at 9:10, there was a huge bolt of lightning that came down out of the sky and hit somewhere in the tank farm here.
I was in my bedroom looking out the window towards the west, and it was just like a big fan of fire was what I saw. And we had little narrow windows that opened to inward, and they blew open with the explosion. So I ran into my mother and I said, Mother, the tanks have exploded.
Fire department started out on it, found out that they weren't equipped to handle anything like that. All the departments in Orange County were called up for help. A lot of people started coming in town. They immediately had the police department had to get out to direct traffic. Different oil companies sent all their men in to help. And it really went very smooth, I thought.
Right now I'm at the corner of Madrona Street and Imperial Highway. Now in the disaster, the weather didn't really help either.
A big wind came up, and they said that often that a big fire that way will cause a wind. And it was kind of like a cyclone. It just came hurling up Imperial, and that was when Sutphen's roof went off. So of course with all that, we ran back home to get away from it.
Union Oil had run 5 or 6 big trucks down what's now Lambert Road, right below the fire, loaded with men to fight it. They had left the trucks and gone up around the fire. When the burning oil in these tanks boiled over and come down there in the Rigger River, they burnt the trucks up to practically nothing was ever found of them but a few small chunks of metal. It burned all the orange groves there.
We had friends in Orange, and they said that they could go out in their front yard and read a newspaper from the light from that fire. Well, you know, there's many things I can't remember in my childhood, but I guess that made such an impression on me that I really remember every minute of it.
Next time on Video Brea Line, we'll be taking you on a historic tour of Old City Hall Park. For Video Brea Line, I'm Brian Saul. Today we're at City Hall Park, and if we could go back to 1924, all the grass and the greenery you see here would be one big empty dirt lot owned by the Union Oil Company. Well, about 1924, there was really nothing in the city for the people to do. So the city fathers decided, well, why don't we put a park here? So they negotiated with the Union Oil Company and purchased 2 small lots. Well, they told the Union Oil Company, well, we're only going to pay for a little bit of these lots, and then when the voters decide to purchase the whole piece of property, we'll pay for those lots. Well, 3 years later, in 1927, there was a bond issue that passed, and the bond issue was for $60,000. And what that included was for a plunge, a city hall, and in that city hall would be the city offices, naturally. There would be a fire department, there would be a police department, there would be the library. Over the years, the city park has basically stayed the same. There are a few structures, new structures have been built, but the old structures are still around. Today I'm going to be taking a tour of some of those buildings and telling you about some things that used to be here. For instance, where the Rose Garden is now, the Memorial Rose Garden, there used to be a large fountain. Now this fountain was built in 1948, and it was dedicated to a man, a very important man in our city, named Mr. Schaffer. Now when Mr. Schaffer died, his employees decided they were going to do something special for him. So they built a large fountain here. It was an octagonal fountain, quite large. And what was kind of special about it is when people would drive along Brea Boulevard in the evenings, and they would park across the street, and they would look at that fountain. And the reason they were looking at it is because in the evenings there would be jets of water that would come out that would be lighted by colored lights. Now the fountain was only here for about 12, 15 years, and then it was removed. As I said, today we're going to be visiting some of the buildings here in the park. And the first building we're going to be talking about is over on the corner of Elm and Brea Boulevard, and it's the old American Legion building. So why don't we go over there now? Now this isn't the first American Legion Hall building that was on this spot. Back in the early 1920s, there was a wooden structure here, and that stayed here until after the City Hall and the Plunge were built, and then this structure was built. As you can see, it's also in the Mediterranean style like the other two with the tile roofs. Now over the year, this building has been used for various uses. Of course, it was the American Legion Hall for many years, and then it became the Brea Police Department. And it was the police department until 1980 when the police department moved to the Civic Center. As you can see, it's now being used as an emergency ambulance building. Now there's a really interesting story about this building. Back in 1933, when the Long Beach earthquake struck, it was a pretty devastating earthquake. Now we felt it up here, but it wasn't as devastating naturally as in Long Beach. Well, after the earthquake, a call went out from Long Beach for help. So cars from all over this area went down and picked up some of the people who had lost their homes or lost their properties, and they were brought back to this building where a soup kitchen and cots were set out. So the people were housed here until they were able to go back to their own homes. As you can see, I'm here on the basketball courts. Now these basketball courts weren't always here. At one time in this location, there used to be a large pond with frogs and fish. Now, ponds were popular back in the 1930s when it was built, and a lot of the homes in this area had them, so the park had to have one too. Probably the building that most people think of when they think of City Hall Park is the Brea City Plunge, which was built in 1929. Now, back in '29, when this plunge was built, this was a really special place because there were no other plunges in all of Orange County. In fact, there were very few of them in Southern California. Also because there weren't too many swimming pools. Well, in fact, there were no private swimming pools, and people really didn't go to the beach very often. People really didn't have suits. So when the plunge was open, they would rent suits here to the people who came. Now, if you were driving along Brea Boulevard back in 1929 or the 30s, or even the 40s, and you look over this direction, you would have seen bathing suits and rented towels hanging all around the plunge on clotheslines. Now there's some things here at the plunge that used to be here that are no longer here. And one of those is about right here. And what that was, there was a fountain. Now the water really didn't shoot up in the air. It kind of dribbled over the sides and down to the bottom. And then way down at the deep end of the plunge, there used to be a high diving board where people would come and kind of show off what they could do in the way of diving in the city. Now, in 1989, the plunge here underwent major renovation. The outside stayed basically the way it was, but the inside is completely different.
I graduated from high school in 1929 in this summer, so I came down to the city and made an application for a lifeguard, and I was lucky, and I obtained a position here. And there's a lady, Mrs. Gurley, elderly lady, and she was put in charge as the matron of the plunge. I suppose she just looked at everything went in